If you're like me and wanted to get a good understanding of what climate change is all about, I figured it's best to start with a set of simple questions. Where are the top 5 carbon emissions coming from? And what are the top 5 solutions we have to address them? That's what brought me to this book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates. Climate change is the issue of our time because it affects everyone and everything. In fact, the economic impact of climate change is expected to be as bad as having a COVID-sized pandemic every 10 years. The good news is we can do something about climate change. And the book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates, is about outlining the problem and creating opportunities to solve it. We are at the same point today with climate change as we were several years ago with pandemic. Ironically, Bill Gates gave a TED Talk in 2014 echoing how health experts were saying that the world was not prepared to handle a future pandemic. Despite their warnings, the world didn't do enough to prepare. Then sure enough, COVID-19 came knocking on our door. That's exactly where we are today with climate change, and why it's important that we prepare and execute a plan of action. There's one number we need to know: 51 billion tons. This is the amount of carbon emissions we're adding to the atmosphere every year, and that number is increasing. Our goal is to bring that number to zero. That's the challenge. To avoid a climate disaster, we need to do that by 2050. This is what 1 ton of carbon actually looks like. It's about the size of a car. Each one of us in the industrialized world is responsible for putting it into the atmosphere roughly every month. Imagine Earth as a bathtub filling with water, except the water is greenhouse gas emissions. Even if we slow down the flow of water, the bathtub will still fill up and overflow, which is why we need to get to zero and not just reduce our carbon emissions. Unless we stop adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the temperature will keep going up and our earthly bathtub will overflow. And the only way to do that is to turn off the water, to get to zero. Why should we care? Well, because a small rise in the Earth's temperature affects us all, no matter where you are. Temperatures will not stop rising in Texas unless emissions stop rising in India, and vice versa. We're already experiencing hotter summers, colder winters, and more extreme natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires every year. Extreme droughts will make food more expensive and difficult to grow. Sea level rises will cause coastal places to flood, displacing people who live there. More and more people will seek asylum from these disasters, creating climate refugees. People and the economy will suffer almost as often as the seasons change. We should be looking out for each other and our planet. That's why. So where do all the emissions come from? Here's a breakdown of the 51 billion tons of annual emissions. We need solutions in all of these areas. For each section of the pie, we'll outline the problems, solutions, and areas for innovation. Let's start with how we make electricity, the 27% of the 51 billion tons. We are addicted to electricity. We are expected to use 50% more electricity by 2050 because as our world population and quality of life increases, our demand for energy will increase as well. So how do we get electricity to more people and do it cleanly? No one source can replace fossil fuels, which provide 2/3 of the world's power generation. Figuring out how to get all the benefits of cheap, reliable electricity without emitting greenhouse gases is the single most important thing we must do to avoid a climate disaster. Electricity is cheap because fossil fuels are cheap. In fact, oil is cheaper than a soft drink. Clean power is just plain more expensive. Roughly, the additional cost between the two is called a green premium, comparing the dirtier, carbon-emitting source against a cleaner, carbon-free source. Here's an example of a green premium. Jet fuel costs $2.22 per gallon, and the carbon-free biofuels cost $5.35 per gallon. So the green premium is the difference, which is $13.13. That's a premium of more than 140%. A green premium is actually a great tool in measuring our progress in combating climate change. By monitoring the cost of these premiums, we can track our progress in decarbonizing. So how can oil be cheaper than soda? It's because the systems that we have in place to incentivize or extract fossil fuels are robust. We need to turn that around. The solution is then to transition away from carbon-emitting sources and towards cleaner forms of energy. Just like we built systems to support cheap energy production using fossil fuels, we can do the same to build cheap energy production using cleaner alternatives. But what are the alternatives? We typically think of solar panels, wind farms, and hydroelectric plants. There's a problem though: intermittency. No one clean energy source can replace fossil fuels because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Clean energy sources are inherently intermittent, but our need for power is not. We want it all the time. Mixing various clean energy sources based on geography and climate will play a substantial role in getting us to zero. In fact, we need them to. Bill advocates that nuclear power is our best bet and most effective source of clean energy generation. The energy we give up by not using coal, natural gas, and oil has to come from somewhere, and mostly it will come from these clean energy sources. Not only do we need to generate power, but we also need to move it from place to place. Crisscrossing the country with thousands of miles of special long-distance power lines carrying what's called high-voltage current can do just that, and we're already doing it, where we can transfer electricity from state to state. If we could do that for the world, it would be transformative. Completely decarbonizing America's power grid by 2050 will require tripling the amount of capacity we add every year for the next 30 years. To help with that, we need innovation in energy storage. It's extremely difficult and expensive to store electricity on a large scale. But that's one of the things we'll need to do if we're going to rely on intermittent sources to provide a significant portion of clean energy. Another innovative approach in this area is figuring out how to capture and store the carbon we emit from generating power. Lastly, we can just use less electricity. Next up, manufacturing. 31% of the pie comes from making things like cement, steel, and plastics. We make materials that are just as essential to modern life as electricity, and we're not going to give them up, because we'll be using more and more of them as the world population grows and gets richer. In fact, we're expected to build a New York City worth of buildings every month for the next 40 years, which is why it's important that we find cleaner ways to make things like cement to combat construction emissions. Here's where the emissions come from. When we use fossil fuels to generate electricity that factories need to run their operations. When we use fossil fuels to generate heat needed for various manufacturing processes, like melting iron ore to make steel. When we actually make these materials, like the way cement manufacturing inevitably creates carbon dioxide. For example, when we make 1 ton of cement, we'll get 1 ton of carbon dioxide. Making 1 ton of steel produces about 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide. Why do we do it this way? Just like fossil fuels, because it's cheap. Here's where the green premiums come back into play. We can lower the cost of clean products by creating incentives or even requirements to buy zero-carbon cement or steel. Businesses are much more likely to pay a premium for cleaner materials if the law requires it, their customers demand it, and their competitors are doing it. So how can we eliminate these emissions? One approach is to take recycled carbon dioxide and inject it back into cement before it's used at a construction site. Pretty cool, right? Another more theoretical approach involves making cement out of seawater and the carbon dioxide captured from power plants. The inventors behind this idea think it could ultimately cut emissions by more than 70%. To sum up, the path to zero emissions in manufacturing looks like this. Electrify every process possible, which will take a lot of innovation. Get that electricity from a power grid that's been decarbonized, which will also take a lot of innovation, and use carbon capture to absorb the remaining emissions. Lastly, just use materials more efficiently. Don't let anything go to waste. Next up is growing things. Agriculture accounts for 19% of the 51 billion tons of carbon emissions every year, and that number could go up because our population is increasing. Right now, in 2021, there are over 7.8 billion people on this planet. We're expected to reach 10 billion people by 2100. So our food consumption will inevitably increase, especially when it comes to meat. There are roughly 1 billion cattle raised for beef and dairy around the world, which account for about 4% of global emissions. Some say we should stop eating meat altogether. The appeal of the argument is there, but it's not realistic in the near future. Meat plays too important a role in human culture. But we can cut down on eating meat while still enjoying the taste of meat. One option is plant-based meat, which have convincing substitutes for ground beef, like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. It's predicted that eventually these alternatives will be cheaper than animal meat. We can also cut down on our emissions from food we eat by wasting less of it. In Europe, more than 20% of the food is wasted. In the United States, it's 40%. Nearly half of all the food that we make in the US just goes to waste. It's bad for people who don't have enough to eat, bad for the economy, and bad for climate change. When food rots, it produces enough methane to cause as much warming as 3.3 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year. The most important solution here is behavior change, using more of what we have and wasting less of it. Innovations in farming efficiency and techniques will also help combat these emissions as well. One last thing here, nearly a third of agricultural emissions come from deforestation. The world has lost more than a Peru-sized forest of trees since 1990. Trees can absorb about 4 tons of carbon dioxide over 40 years, and when trees burn down, they release those emissions. Planting more trees seems like a good catch-all solution until you realize it won't be enough. We'd need about 50 acres worth of trees planted in tropical areas to absorb the emissions produced by just one American. Multiply that by the population of the United States, and we'd need roughly half the landmass of the world covered with tropical trees. And that's just for the US alone. Next up, getting around. Transportation accounts for 8.2 billion tons of our annual carbon emissions, and those emissions are expected to go up as demand for transportation grows. Aviation, trucking, and shipping account for all emission growths in this area. Shipping routes alone, which handle 90% of the goods traded around the world by volume, produce nearly 3% of global emissions. Passenger vehicles account for half of these emissions. Medium and heavy-duty trucks account for another 30%. Airplanes at 1/10 of all emissions. We can't electrify all these vehicles because the bigger the vehicle and the farther you want to move it without recharging, the harder it will be to use electricity as the power source. Because we can't electrify our cargo trucks and planes, the only solutions available today are electrofuels and advanced biofuels. The most effective way we can move towards zero emissions from transportation is by switching to electric vehicles where we can and alternative fuels where we can't. Our last category, keeping warm and staying cool. Heating and air conditioning account for 7% of the 51 billion tons of annual emissions. Worldwide electricity demand for cooling will triple by 2050. Air conditioning is no longer just a luxury tool for the summer heat. Our modern economy depends on it. Cloud storage server farms that have your photos and files readily available generate large amounts of heat that need to stay cool. But what about heating? Water heaters and furnaces are the biggest culprits in this sector because they account for 1/3 of all emissions from the world's buildings. Unlike lights and AC units, most water heaters and furnaces run on fossil fuels, not electricity. Right now, most of the power we generate around the world is still a carbon-intensive process. That's why all the electricity used by buildings is responsible for nearly 14% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Ironically, the very thing we're doing to survive in a changing climate, running air conditioners in the summers and heaters in the winters, will make climate change worse, and we'll be stuck in a vicious cycle. So what can we do about it? To decarbonize our air conditioners, we need to decarbonize our power grids. The path to zero carbon for heating actually looks similar to what we've seen before. Electrify where we can by getting rid of natural gas water heaters and furnaces and replacing them with electric heat pumps. Governments will have to update their policies to allow and encourage these upgrades. Next, decarbonize the power grid by developing clean fuels to do everything else. There you have it. These are the categories that make up the 51 billion tons of carbon emissions we release into the atmosphere every year. These are the areas we need to focus on to get to zero. And we need to start now. But where should we start? The answer? The ones with low green premiums, or no green premium at all. If we're not deploying these solutions already, it's a sign that cost isn't a barrier. It's something else, like outdated public policies or lack of awareness. And where do we need to focus on innovation most? The answer? Wherever we decide green premiums are too high. Working to lower green premiums is not charity. It's like investing in R&D. It's an opportunity to make scientific breakthroughs that will give birth to new industries and new companies, creating jobs and reducing emissions at the same time. It's time we address the elephant in the room. Who is responsible for most of our global emissions? The answer is the wealthiest nations. Who will be impacted the hardest? The poorest 1 billion people in the world. 40% of the world's emissions come from the richest 16% of the population. With climate change, the poor will become poorer, and it's not their fault, because food will be harder to grow and more expensive for those who can least afford it. The world needs to provide more energy so the poorest can thrive, but we need to provide that energy without releasing any more greenhouse gases. Contrary to popular belief, life around the world is getting better, not worse. Here's the main proof. Extreme poverty has almost halved in the past 20 years. That's incredible. This rapid growth and progress is a good thing. People's lives around the world are improving in countless ways: income, education, life expectancy, and so on. Along with this growth, we need to be mindful of the materials we emit by providing cheap, reliable, and clean energy solutions for the poor, so we avoid undoing the progress we've made to lift people out of poverty. There is no one-fix-all approach. Solutions are very much tailored to the region. Until we put a price on carbon, we'll never get a handle on climate change. To do that, we can have a cap-and-trade program or a carbon tax that can help make clean energy as cost-effective as fossil fuels are today. That's how we bring green premiums to zero. The idea isn't to punish people for their greenhouse gases. It's to create an incentive for investors to create competitive carbon-free alternatives. Governments can nudge producers and consumers toward more efficient decisions. You're a lot more likely to try to invent a new kind of electrofuel if you know it won't be undercut by artificially cheap gasoline. So how can we come up with more solutions to combat climate change? Using a fundamental principle in economics: supply and demand. One part involves expanding the supply of innovations, and the other involves accelerating the demand for innovations. Right now, we're only spending $22 billion per year on clean energy innovation, which is just 0.02% of the global economy. Governments need to spend 5 times more on R&D for clean energy, and the potential payoffs are enormous. By collaborating between public and private sectors, governments can drive cleaner technologies just like they did historically with fossil fuels. But that's for governments. What about us? What can we do individually? We actually have more power in this than we might think. People can trigger demand for cleaner solutions. If more people buy solar panels, plant-based meat alternatives, upgrade their heating and cooling systems for their homes, insulate their windows, buy better light bulbs, we play a part in dictating the demand for the kind of technology we want, and businesses will rise to the occasion to meet the demand. If enough people send the same signal, companies will respond, and quickly. Some other things we can do is drive a hybrid or an EV and use public transportation. Lastly, and this is really important, vote. Policymakers can take on only so many problems at once, and they decide what's high priority based on what they hear from their constituents, you. Since this channel originally sparked on my Spider-Man stop-motion films, I'd like to conclude with this well-known quote based on my favorite superhero of all time. With great power comes great responsibility. And our responsibility is to take care of each other on this planet so we can all enjoy its beauty today and for generations to come.